Hello, lovely viewers. My name is Dan Downs, and welcome to another fine episode of Lessons Learned. Today, we are hopping right in with Swift Playgrounds, charting our journey of learning Swift, and we thought it'd be appropriate to jump in using Apple's most elementary and basic tool for learning how to program and play with Swift. So, without further ado, let us begin. Okay, so here we are in Swift Playgrounds. Swift Playgrounds is an educational video game by Apple, and Playgrounds teaches people how to use Swift. Pretty straightforward. A little bit about my background. I have a complex relationship with programming and computer science broadly over the years. It has been very much a complex relationship. About my background as a kid, I took real pride in my technological sophistication and technical savvy. In the late 90s, I used to make websites for people in such programs as MS Front Page, which, for those of you who may not be aware, is a 90s WYSIWYG tool for HTML use and primarily focused on website building and website administration. Later on, did the same using the Microsoft Expression Web Suite, which was like Front Page, a little bit less WYSIWYG, a little bit more technical, and similarly designed for HTML use for the creation of web pages. After that, I took 2 semesters of Visual Basic in high school, which maybe I'll get into a little later, but suffice to say they were not the greatest experience. So, before jumping in, I want to get into my considerations, focusing on what I have and really what I'm aiming to get out of this. So, as you get older, you learn a thing or two about how you as an individual effectively learn and develop new knowledge and have new information go inside your brain, right? I am not an expert in pedagogy, but I have read a thing or two over the years, and I've learned certainly a little bit about how I best take in new information. So, to start, I definitely wanted to learn computer programming from scratch. I was really influenced by two approaches. Number one, from personal experience, I had the privilege of meeting a lot of individuals who are technically savvy, both in the tech industry as well as through passive life experiences. I've gotten to know some, really hardcore Eastern Europeans who they learned their computer programming in a very unique fashion. This was, 90s Eastern Europe or 90s Russia, and they learned this stuff manually. So paper, pencil, textbook, and going through it at a very elementary level and making sure everything was incredibly tight. So that's number one. Number two, Neal Stephenson's Diamond Age, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend checking out. Stephenson is famous for his writings, among them Snow Crash, which ranks among one of my favorite books and is arguably one of the most influential, if not the most influential, cyberpunk novels in history. One of those books that, once you read it, you quickly realize the scope and scale of its impact on both popular culture as well as the actual development of technology by people who were inspired by such a great book. The sequel, The Diamond Age by Neal Stephenson, has a lot of really interesting thoughts. It's mostly a rumination on learning and pedagogy, but one of the parts of the book dives into the fundamentals of computer programming and the core concepts of computer science. They are presented to the protagonist not through liberal education nor through vocational education, but instead through gamification, like what we have here. The protagonist, she plays video games in a complex and immersive simulated environment, and this teaches her how the whole thing works. Good gamification is immersive, it's addicting, It does focus on the deep understanding of fundamentals, and it synthesizes both liberal education and vocational education traditions to actually hack the user's brain, hack the student's brain, makes the iterative cycles very tight, and forces them to learn. It looks like Swift Playgrounds, or I'm sorry, looks like Playgrounds does exactly that. And so, with that in mind, we dive in. So, starting fresh, what works, what doesn't work. I can tell you it starts out very simple. It is incredibly immersive. Each module has you taking in a lesson and then writing the code for it, then executing the code. And if it works out, your little character, in this case, I believe this is Byte, this character is able to effectively navigate the landscape of the puzzle based on the directions that are programmed. Really interesting. I think there's a strong focus in the program on good practices, and so far I've really enjoyed. Criticisms. So before moving on, I should note that I have not yet completed all the official company modules. I'm about halfway through. Additionally, there are third-party modules that get into more advanced topics, including Apple's Bluetooth API, Apple's AR Dev platform. Things can get relatively complex, and Playgrounds, even though it looks like it was originally aimed at children, people are starting to build on it to have much more complex and advanced structures of education, so that people may engage with this software suite to effectively learn the Swift language, which I'm a big fan of. That's awesome. So what we are going to do, I think it's important that this does stress repetition. I think that stressing repetition is done well here, but it's not done in its totality. My hack around that was manually writing out code by hand. So let's see if we can pull this up here. So going on to my Twitter account, looking at some tweets, I wrote a little bit about thoughts I had. Some thoughts I think were valid, some thoughts were less valid, and people were kind enough to point out what worked and what didn't work in my thought processes. But one thing I did post, which I'm happy to share, is that I did take the lessons, and most of the lessons were done manually by hand before actually typing in the code. And what you see here is some code I drafted, as well as a diagram of how I imagined the character Byte would navigate the landscape. So you can sort of see this here. I would take this, drew out the grid. I believe this is a 7x8 grid, and being able to draw it out allows me to effectively visualize the path that Byte was going to take and write this down before actually putting in the code and committing. So I understand that there are multiple ways to go about the process. It is considered core to the best practices of learning to code to actually just play around with it, see what works, see what doesn't work. I think that is well and good, and I support that approach. However, I think that when you're very early in mastering the fundamentals, it's essential to be very basic, very precise, and really deeply understand what's going on here. I understand that if you are a computer programmer for a large company and you are not working on something that's completely evergreen code, instead you're more on the upkeep side, or you're hacking together something that's not really sophisticated, but is instead just necessary to patch a hole. I know this means that a lot of your job may be going out there, GitHub, copy pasting some code that others have developed, and if something doesn't work, you can sort of play around with it live in the actual dev environment. This allows for the rapid execution of code, the rapid onboarding of code, but for the individual does not necessarily mean that they understand it in a deep way. And while it is very nice that with most code these days being open source openly shared, widely disseminated. A single developer can take code that is used by that is used by that's actually developed by an individual, a single individual, and then is able to deploy it and use it for their company. That's great, and I think that does allow things to get done. It does allow for products to be built, but at a foundational level, you really should understand this stuff in a deeper way, and that's my focus here. Building on that, one of the annoying things about playgrounds, which I've discovered very recently, is that you find that when you load up the software again, if you haven't touched it for, let's say, 24 hours, this occurs, which is the actual code crashes. You hit cancel here, and then you have to say hit start over. And what this does is it basically resets the module, and your code goes away. So what ended up happening for me is, in addition to this being a bug, forced me to essentially go over to my GitHub, where I have my repos. And luckily, as part of my learning process and focusing on the fundamentals, I have been taking the code that I wrote by hand that had been validated by Playgrounds and then committing it to my personal repos. This forces me to go here, figure out which module is broken, and then copy paste the code from my notes. So this is nice that I've previously been doing this. I imagine the vast majority of people who are working with Playgrounds aren't necessarily doing this, because it does take time and it's a real pain in the butt to exhibit best practices. But that being said, I have been able to make it work. I would recommend that those who actually built Playgrounds, may be appropriate for them to engage in some best practices with regards to keeping track of different software iterations. I don't know if that's appropriate at this level, because this is the introductory phase, but it is a thought. So, in summary, let's just run this code here, see if it works out. In summary, I am a fan of Playgrounds. It is simple, it is immersive, it is foundational, it does focus on best practices. I think it could use homework, to be honest. Look at that typo found. Fix the typo and move forward. Okay. I think it could use homework. Personally, for me, homework would be advantageous. New adventures, challenges, or modules that force the learner to solve things at a very basic level and force them to master the topic. In the syntax of this program, maybe it would be appropriate to call them side quests or something else. But as of right now, it doesn't have that. I think that could be very useful. It is also a little bit buggy. It looks like, ironically, my code has failed, so I'm going to have to troubleshoot this for a few minutes. But for Swift itself, or rather for Playgrounds itself, I think if they were able to fix the problem of the actual modules crashing after you minimize the program or close it out, that would be very helpful and very nice for the long-term continuity of both the user's code as well as the stability of the program itself. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much for the time. Throw the like, subscribe, or other following for this, and thanks for following along. It's a pleasure to work with you guys in my process of learning. Goodbye.